Welcome to this teaching on rebirth or reincarnation. I want to start with addressing a common question about the concept of rebirth in Buddhism, which is if there's no inherently existent self or soul, what gets reborn? So I'm going to talk about that. I'll also talk about how karma is related to the process of rebirth. So if you missed the first video in this 3-part series, you can find links to that in the show notes below. And if you want the next part, which will be coming out next week, I will also put a link to that when it's available. If you want a deeper dive into rebirth and how that works, you can find more on that in my new book, The Buddhist Path to Joy. I'll have a link to that also in the show notes. I want to start today's talk about rebirth or reincarnation just by addressing the question that sometimes comes up of like, is it rebirth or is it reincarnation? And sometimes people would say, like, in Buddhism, it's better to use the word rebirth because there's not like a sort of permanent self or soul that gets like reincarnated, like rebodied. I think in English, we just tend to use the words interchangeably, so I'm going to use them interchangeably too. There's no meaning behind which word I use, so I just want to say that up front. And the first thing that I want to talk about today in terms of reincarnation is what actually gets reincarnated. So if you're at all familiar with the Buddhist teachings, you know that there's this teaching of anatta or anatman, which basically means there's no inherently existent self. There's a body, there's the mind. You can think of it in terms of the 5 aggregates from Theravada and early forms of Buddhism. You can think of this in different ways. But basically, it's not like there's an essence of Clareness or something that like when I die is going to go on and someone else is going to be like Claire 2.0. You might have heard of reincarnating lamas like the Dalai Lamas, the Karmapas, the Panchen Lamas. So I'll just take the Dalai Lamas as an example because they're the most famous reincarnating lineage. I think often people talk about the Dalai Lamas, like we're on the 14th currently, the 14th Dalai Lama. And sometimes people talk about them as just like, the same person coming back again and again. And there's actually a lot of difference between the personalities of the different Dalai Lamas. So it's not like it's just one person coming back. But also I want to point out that from a Tibetan perspective, the Dalai Lamas are not actually a case of reincarnation the way that, we might think of it in terms of like ordinary beings like ourselves. Like when I die, I will be thrown into my next lifetime because of karma. And I'll talk about this later and how this works. But when the Dalai Lama dies, like he's considered an awakened being. He's considered an emanation of the Buddha of compassion, Avalokiteshvara in Sanskrit or Chenrezig in Tibetan. So when he dies and takes another rebirth, from a Tibetan perspective, it's not the case that it's not the case that karma is driving that rebirth. What's actually driving it is compassion and wisdom and the vow that the Dalai Lamas have taken, the vow that the Buddhas have all taken, to basically keep coming back until all living beings are free from all suffering. So if we think about, those most famous cases of reincarnation, they're actually not what necessarily happens to us. And even in those cases, it's not like there's a self that keeps coming back. I mean, the Buddha of compassion is just compassionate energy. Like the Buddha of compassion, doesn't have like a driver's license and a social security number. Like there's no like fixed sense of identity there. We're talking about a reality beyond really time. So I just want to clarify that to kind of set the terms of the discussion that we're having. We're talking about those of us who are ordinary beings, and when we die, we're going to be sort of tossed into our next lifetime. Key says that really clarified something. Okay, awesome. I'm glad to hear that. I think sometimes it's good to just, make that distinction between a rebirth based on compassion versus a rebirth based on karma. And for most of us, excuse me. For most of us, a rebirth based on karma, it's a way more practical thing to talk about because that's what we're in for, unless you're secretly a very advanced being. So if we're talking about rebirth or reincarnation in a Buddhist sense, there's no like self or soul or something like that that's just going from one body to the next. So what actually causes rebirth? And this is something that it's a Buddhist position that other people have critiqued for like millennia. Like when Buddhism was just starting as a tradition before it was even called Buddhism. I mean, calling it Buddhism is actually pretty recent and it's a Western thing. But anyway, way back in the day, the non-Buddhist traditions of India would say like, if there's no self, if there's no Atman or Atta, then like, how can you even talk about reincarnation? Because what reincarnates? And the Buddhist answer is basically there's not some unchanging sort of sacred, separate thing that is meanness, but there is a continuity of mind. And really, when Buddhists talk about mind, they're talking about experience. So a continuity of mind means as I come to my moment of death, let's just say like best case scenario, I'm super old, I'm ready to go, etc., etc. So I'm there, I'm preparing myself. I'm like, this is my moment. And as I die, you know, one thing that's said to be really important is to have a positive state of mind as you die. Because the state of mind, like the last moment of mind or experience from this lifetime is gonna shape the beginning of my intermediate state, my time in what Tibetans call the bardo, the time between death and rebirth. And if I die with a positive state of mind, I'm more likely to have positive experiences in that bardo state. And then it's our, again, this is the Tibetan model. Other schools of Buddhism would say different things, but like this is the model that I'm trained in, so it's what I'm going to share. So at the end of that bardo state, that in-between state, it's our state of mind that determines what we kind of naturally gravitate to next. So, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, they don't necessarily talk about like spirit guides or anyone who's going to help you choose your next lifetime. Like they don't actually even say that you get to consciously choose your parents, your lifetime, where you're going to be born into. What they say instead is basically you come toward the end of this intermediate state. And then you start seeing these lights. And, you know, you can take this literally, you can take it metaphorically, but they say basically you see, you know, let's say a dull yellow light. And then you see I think you see the really brilliant, bright, incredibly intense yellow light first, which is your kind of invitation to take rebirth into a Buddha realm. So, you know, you're leaving behind a physical body, you're kind of waking up to something much closer to your true nature, and you're going to be reborn in this realm where you just get to like hang out with Buddhas and basically become enlightened. So it's a really great, you know, rebirth possibility. But here's the kicker. If during your whole life you really never try to identify that luminous, that non-dual, that spacious aspect of yourself, and that aspect of you seems totally unfamiliar, then when you see that incredibly luminous, say, yellow light in the bardo state, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, that feels like home. You're going to be like, ah, what's that? And then when the dim yellow light appears afterwards, that's what you might be drawn to because it feels more comfortable. So without going into all the different realms, all the different possibilities for, you know, where you could take rebirth, and again, it's in my new book, The Buddhist Path to Joy. It's at the top, toward the top of the chat if you're interested in it. It's also free today. But basically, there's all these different realms we could take rebirth into. So we could take rebirth into a Buddha realm, and like I said, have this wonderful opportunity for awakening. We could take rebirth into the human realm again. We could take rebirth as an animal. We could take rebirth as a hell being. We could take rebirth in like, it's called the God realm, and just have this amazing, incredible experience for like eons and eons until our good karma runs out, and then we get reborn back into a less pleasant realm. So our state of mind as we die, and then our state of mind going through the bardo in between death and rebirth is really important for which state we're drawn toward. And, you know, if you don't take reincarnation literally, If you prefer to take it metaphorically, I just want to say there is actually some pretty good research on children who claim to remember previous lives. It's been done by researchers at the University of Virginia. It's a topic for another day, but like there's actually some data to support the idea that reincarnation does happen in a literal sense, at least sometimes. But anyway, if you don't want to take reincarnation literally, you can also think of these, different realms of rebirth as like every time you go to bed at night and dream and wake up, you're kind of, the dreams set the tone for the day sets the tone for the next night's dreams. Like we're always creating our own reality, or at least we're always playing an active role in the way that we perceive and shape reality as it kind of comes to us. So I just want to say, these teachings on rebirth, they're not just about what happens in our next lifetime. They're also about how we're creating our future in this lifetime. Whether we're talking about tomorrow or next year or a decade from now, whatever, we're always creating our future. So again, if you missed yesterday's talk on karma, there will be links to that if you're watching later, or you can find it on my podcast, Buddhist Wisdom, Modern Life. So karma is just really, really important. Really, really important. It's the continuity of mind, the continuity of experience that goes from one lifetime to the next. And that is what we have control over. So I want to come back at the end of this talk to what we can do now to try and optimize our future, whether that's in this lifetime or the next lifetime. But before that, I want to talk about a couple of questions that people often have. And again, feel free to drop your questions in chat, and I can address them. If you're watching or listening later, I can address them later. If you're listening on the podcast, you can also find this on YouTube and drop a question in the comments there. He says, I feel that the realms we can reborn into actually exist somewhere in the multiverse. Yeah, exactly. If you had said on this planet, I would have said like, maybe not, like they're not considered to be, like the hell realm, for instance. You get reborn into the hell realm by being intensely hateful. Like this is not just, I smushed a couple of bugs and then I felt good about it. This is, hi Ursula, hello. This is like Hitler, where your job in life is not just to be happy, but actively to try and eliminate, a large number of people. Or so when I talk about the hell realms, if you have kind of Christian upbringing PTSD, you should just know you get sent to hell realms not because of what you believe, but because of what you do. You don't get sent to hell realms. I mean, you create the hell realm with your mind, but it's not a separate place from here. It's you die and your mind is so full of hatred that the thing that makes sense to you is a continuation of that hatred. So anyway, it's said that those hell realms, they're not separate. It's like if we had, they talk about siddhis or meditative powers that people develop through their practice. So some people are said to be able to see hell beings and, so it's not separate. I think the idea of a multiverse or other dimensions or whatever, it sounds kind of sci-fi, but I mean, A, it might turn out to be a pretty good description of reality, and B, I think it's a pretty good way of thinking about these Buddhist teachings, that these are different dimensions of what exists. And there's actually there's a story of a great Tibetan master who had lived this really wonderful life, and he was coming toward the time of death, and he was really making aspirations that he wanted to be reborn in a hell realm in order to help those hell beings. So that's a lot of compassion, because there are all these descriptions of the ground of the hell realm is made of super hot metal and your feet are burned up as you stand on it. So they're intensely negative places to be, but nothing is permanent. No hell realm is permanent. No, heavenly realm is permanent. When you've used up the karma that got you into that realm of existence in the first place, you're reborn somewhere else. So that's something, helpful to know about all these different, these different realms. So the next thing I want to talk about is this question that I think comes up a lot of whether or not, or like maybe how we connect to the same people in past and future lives as we're connected to now. And, you know, like I talk about reincarnation and karma and like, I don't know, Buddha nature. So in a way, I try to be as non-woo-woo as possible, but I'm going to probably say some stuff that sounds woo-woo. You know, there's this idea of like soulmates and soul families and stuff like that. And like, I mean, I'm not going to weigh in on those ideas. I'm not really trained in the traditions that they come from. But basically, Buddhism says, again, remember, rebirth is like driven by karma. And Buddhism says, whoever you make karma with, that's who you're likely to end up with again. So not just good karma, but bad karma too. And the basic idea is, I like to think of karma as like the ripples that come out when you drop a rock into a lake. So imagine that you drop a rock and someone else drops a rock over there. The ripples from the two rock droppings will interact with each other and create a new pattern. Excuse me. So like when we create a significant amount of karma with someone, we're connecting ourselves in this subtle way with them. So I mentioned some research earlier into reincarnation, into children who claim to remember previous lives. And something really, really fascinating that the researchers have found is that a lot of these tend to be what they call same family cases, especially in cultures, I think like the Inuit and other cultures believe that when someone dies, they're more likely to be reborn into their own family. So sometimes you get cases in which, for instance, this one boy was born and he remembered his grandmother's lifetime. So like, that's not that surprising, right? I mean, maybe his parents had talked about his grandmother, or, you know, he had heard things about her in the community and he would have certain facts, but he also had facts that no one else knew. Like he said, for instance, oh, you need to dig under the floorboards or whatever here in this specific place. This is where I hid money or treasure or something like that. And they dug, and sure enough, like nobody knew about the hiding place of this. I forget what it was. But he did, and it was the grandmother who had buried it there. So, you know, there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that family, that we spend a lot of time with, that we can end up coming back connected with them again. There's a really funny case from India where a woman and her neighbor had this dispute about the water that was coming to their farms. And the neighbor was always accusing her of stealing his water that should be coming to his farm. The neighbor died. The woman gave birth to a child. I think it was a son. And the son, when he could start talking, he started accusing the mother of stealing his water. And he remembered the previous life as that neighbor. So, you know, it's not just the positive connections that we can come back to. Like that kind of strong negative connection looks like it can also show up again in a future life. And that brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about, at least, you know, before we address questions and stuff. And that is, how can we tidy up our karma so that we don't have to keep coming back again and again into dysfunctional relationships, or, you know, connecting ourselves with people who are toxic for us, but we're stuck to them somehow. And again, in yesterday's talk on karma, I mentioned, you know, from like this perspective looking forward, how we can try and tidy up our karma. And also from this perspective, looking back, you know, how some of our relationships may be kind of inherited from a previous life, or some of our karmic tendencies, you know, they might just be really hard to uproot. They might show up as these patterns, as, you know, certain types of behavior we wish we could stop, but we just can't. So from the perspective of reincarnation or rebirth, this really takes on even more importance, because when I die, from a Buddhist perspective, I don't get to choose where I'm going next. I don't get to choose whether I want to be a human, what family I want to get reborn into, what genetics I'm going to be connected to. I'm just going to be, again, from a Buddhist perspective, tossed into whatever lifetime I'm like drawn toward. So it gives us a big incentive to really like clean up our act now, to take stock. You know, sometimes people in like the coaching industry talk about taking an inventory of like how you spend your time, how you spend your energy, how you spend your resources. It could be a great idea to kind of sit down and do that for this lifetime. Like, imagine you were planning your investment strategy for retirement. You wouldn't just kind of think about it maybe the day before you've planned to retire. I think often, you know, we come to the end of our lifetime and we're like, oh no, I don't have any plan. You know, like I don't have like that kind of built up bank of like positive, you know, mental states to fall back on. So what do I do now? But if we start right now, again, like I said earlier, we're not just sort of tidying up the way that we spend our time, the way we spend our attention for the next lifetime. We're also tidying it up for now so that, you know, the us of the future can look back and say, oh, thank you. I'm really glad to be spending my time, I don't know, getting outdoors, spending time in nature, exercising, cooking good food for myself and my family instead of vegging out in front of YouTube, or, you know, having these like long phone calls where I'm just gossiping with somebody or like just dwelling on negative stuff. So it's really important. You know, this is what Buddhist ethics are all about. It's important to notice what we're doing, why we're doing it, and like a gardener, to be kind of pulling out the weeds and planting the stuff that we want to have, so that when everything, you know, sprouts, we have what we're looking for instead of just having a whole bunch of weeds again. Syl says, I met somebody some years ago and it feels like we've known each other forever. Maybe this explains that feeling. Yes, totally. From a Buddhist perspective, when you meet someone and maybe you instantly are drawn toward them or you instantly dislike them, you know, I don't want to say it's from a previous life, but like it could be. You could also just be, you know, really attuned to subtle signals that they're giving off. You know, I think we all know when somebody's kind of like a, you know, downer kind of person, or when somebody's like a little bit too like amped up for us. But I mean, I had that experience with the guy who's now my husband. Like, he walked up and the first thing he said was, do I know you? And I think the answer was yes. And like, this happens to people a lot. It's not just like an isolated thing. It's not necessarily a thing that you're just making up. I think there are just people we feel really comfortable with from the get-go, even if that's not usually how we interact with people. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this session. If you have questions, if you have comments, if other people have experiences that you think might be like related to previous life stuff, please feel free to drop them in the comments. And while you're doing that, I will just let you know, if you would like to make a donation, that is super helpful. I appreciate it. It helps to support Insight Timer also. And my book, The Buddhist Path to Joy, which is all about the Four Noble Truths and sort of the basic teachings of Buddhism, it is free. It's out. It came out yesterday. It's free today through Friday. So I'll drop the name of that in chat. It's on Amazon, and yeah, you can grab it. It comes also with a link to download guided meditations, journal prompts, stuff like that, to really help you like put the teachings into practice. Logan says, if you've read it, do you have any recommendations on any translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead? Yes, actually. This is not... So the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's actually more of like a genre of literature, not just one. But the book I would recommend for starting to learn about this stuff is called Peaceful Death, Joyful Rebirth. And it is by Tulku Tundup. It's really good. It's really approachable for beginners. It has a lot of stories and stuff in there. Oh, thank you so much, Deanna. She just made a donation. And it's very simple. There's multiple translations. I think the most recent one is by Thupten Jinpa and Robert Thurman. I actually haven't read that one, but it's supposed to be really good. They can be very technical. So I think Peaceful Death, Joyful Rebirth is a really good place to start because it's much clearer and there's not a lot of technical stuff involved. Syl says, what about repetitive dreams? Yeah, so, again, I'll come back to the research by the folks at the University of Virginia. So there are certain types of, I guess, evidence or, things that would suggest to parents, to researchers that a kid might have had a previous life that they were remembering. Repetitive dreams, definitely one of them. Repetitive dreams actually is one of the ones, it's much rarer for an adult to remember a previous life. Those memories tend to fade by about the age of 7 or 8 on average. But there are cases where adults have had, dreams that do provide enough information that researchers were able to check and see, does this fit the life of the person that this child is describing? Yeah, Syl says, I used to have this dream about a beach where a tsunami happened. Exactly. So if you died in a tsunami, it looks like the types of deaths that people are most likely to remember are sudden and traumatic ones. So where they didn't have even, a few minutes of warning that they were about to die, where they died young or where they died, in an accident or something like that. Tsunami is a great example. All of those would be cases or situations that you'd be more likely to remember if it was a previous life. Thank you also for Syl and to Keith for their donations. I appreciate that. Dan says, are there specific types of meditation that could help you tune into what you might have done in a previous life? So here's what I've heard from Tibetan teachers. They say to know your past lives, look at your current body and physical situation. To know your future lives, look at your mind. So, thank you also, Justine. I appreciate your donation. It doesn't really matter if we know what our previous life was. There's an exception. I'll say that in a moment. But what matters is we recognize our karma now and clean it up. Because it's really hard as an adult to try and have any verified sense of what your previous life might have been. One of the methods that the researchers at the University of Virginia tried for, investigating adults' memories was hypnotic regression therapy. And they found that it's just it doesn't tend to be very accurate. So the exception I mentioned earlier is in the case that Syl's mentioning, if you have a traumatic memory from a previous life that could be, some kids have issues that look like PTSD. Even some adults, seem to carry trauma from a previous life into adulthood. So it can be helpful to do a previous life regression, and what comes up may or may not be factual. So you might remember a whole story and maybe none of it actually happened in exactly that way, but maybe those are the images your mind is using to convey to you what did happen. And once that comes out, often people experience a lot of healing. So just to throw that out there, you can try to recover memories, but it's unlikely that as an adult you're gonna intentionally recover them. It seems more likely for people to visit a place where a previous life happened and for those memories to spontaneously come back, or, to see a person they knew in a previous life and again, memories come back. But yeah, from a Buddhist perspective, there's not that much value really to having previous life memories because we all have previous lives. And, whether we remember them or not, they've shaped our present one. So the focus is really more on the present. A Alexa says, what ends a karmic tie to an abusive, in this life, older sister? She says she's had clear past time recall since childhood. Now the abuser controls our aging mom. She says, and well on my awareness path, but she still seems highly harmful to me. Yeah, so from a Buddhist perspective, I mean, you know, I think basically it's the same perspective as you might get from a therapist. That would be about, you know, setting boundaries, noticing why you seem to be like involved with this person. The main thing that would be different, I think, is trying to purify whatever negative karma is keeping you stuck to them. So, you know, the Buddhist perspective really isn't about the tools that are new from Buddhism, I would say, as opposed to like therapy or just interpersonal relationships in general, would be giving you ways to really dissolve those ties from the inside. So definitely it sounds like, you know, professional support could be helpful in a situation where there's abuse involved. But also, you know, there's actually a lot of good meditations on Insight Timer about, you know, cutting karmic ties and stuff like that. And most of them are probably not from a Buddhist perspective, but if you think of it in terms of like, we're stuck together because we both, you know, took actions in a previous life, I think that makes it sort of easier in a way to undo your own like stuckness, because you can't really control anyone else in this lifetime. So I hope that's helpful. You know, I think it's like meditation is not really like a substitute for, you know, boundary setting and, you know, therapeutic interventions and all that kind of good stuff that we have access to. But it can be like one more tool, you know, from the inside to help resolve stuff. So I hope that's helpful, Alexa. I also feel unqualified to give, you know, advice or recommendations about a situation involving abuse, because that is a pretty serious, situation. But thank you so much for joining me, and I hope this has been a helpful conversation. I mean, I hope we all have, you know, smooth and peaceful deaths and joyful rebirths and can tidy up our karma in the meantime.